Today we're talking with Betti Sue Hertz. She's the director and chief curator at the Wallach Art Gallery at Columbia. Betti Sue, thanks so much for, let me just unmute you because you're not unmuted yet. Betti Sue, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for asking me to participate in the series.
So to begin with, we're talking about in this series, we talked about the kind of new conversation with David Ross, other directors, Carol Becker, who I'm sure you know, talking about what is the conversation in terms of where we're at right now. It's such a kind of volatile time in the world, the art world as well. So what's happening in your sphere right now in terms of the Wallach Art Gallery? Because I imagine planning and the future is bringing all these kind of ideas to the forefront.
I guess that's a big question. As you might suspect, we had to shut the gallery in mid-March, and we have been working remotely since then, which of course is a challenge, and also unfortunate because we can't engage with our publics. However, we have continued working not only on the exhibition that was to open in the summer, which we are going to install for the fall, but we've also been doing a lot of online programming, as many other people are. One of the things that we did that I think was exemplary of the kind of energy of the staff is a 12-hour program that was called Uptown People's Assembly, Facing the Raging Pandemics. The gallery has an interesting position because one of its mandates is to be a kind of bridge between the university and the community. And between COVID and the anti-racism movement, we felt that we could really provide a space for uptown artists and community members, arts organizations, as well as various centers and institutes at Columbia University. So what we did is we offered 12 different co-conveners 1 hour on our Zoom screen to basically devise a program, but we asked that each program started with approximately 10 minutes of some kind of presentation, and that the rest of the time we would have a dialogue. And it was incredibly moving and successful. It was at a time when the tension was really, really high around what had happened to George Floyd and the beginning, sort of the beginning weeks of those protests. So we're now in a conversation that is going to be much more broad, because I think the university noticed that we were able to kind of pull the trigger very quickly and engage people in meaningful dialogue, but also beyond talking, give people an opportunity to share sort of the expressive arts, whether it be a video or a story or their visual art. And we continue to think about how can we be this bridge. Our fall show is an exhibition, which is actually a triennial that was started by Deborah Cullen, my predecessor, in 2017. It's, again, for Upper Manhattan artists, but this time we're converging it with the 100th anniversary of the Harlem Renaissance. And that will be about 23 artists whose work somehow connects to that legacy. Plus, we'll be presenting about 6 historical objects of great importance to the Harlem Renaissance. So for us, this is all coming together in many, many different ways. And then, of course, moving forward, we're continuing to do a variety of work that responds not only to the current moment, but also to sort of our role as a university museum.
Thanks for answering that, because it is a big question, and so much is happening. As you said, you pulled this conference together that involved many centers very quickly, and there was a lot of exciting ideas. It's incredible how fast everything's moving, right? Even with all these Zoom talks and new ideas. So out of that meeting that you mentioned, was there an initiative that that was particularly exciting or that rose to the top that seems like a possible model for moving forward in the future?
Yeah, how we framed that 12-hour conversation was that we wanted it to be about listening and sharing, and that we thought that coming up with like new policies or new actions wasn't really what we wanted to be doing. We felt like the community needed a space to sort of express how they were feeling. There are some amazing, I just started at Columbia in September, so I'm just starting to learn both the university and the community. And there's some amazingly talented artists that are, working in Harlem. And I think that, I was really excited about a storyteller, Daniel, I'm going to blank out on his last name. I'll come up with it, or maybe someone will write it in the chat, who is a storyteller. We saw that there was a weaving of interest in someone like Langston Hughes that started with a video and sort of ended with some storytelling that evoked Langston Hughes. And there was also exercises, like we did a meditation. We did some dancing. We had a DJ. And I think that what I would say comes out of that is how do you create a platform where many voices can rise together in a particular moment? And isn't really that what a gallery does? Isn't that what a curator does, is bring people together, both artists and the viewer, in order to sort of share experiences? And so we had to translate the spatial version of that into a sort of durational version in some way, which I think really expanded our sense of possibility.
I like that idea of many voices rising together. I mean, that speaks to what's happening globally, but also speaks to the idea of artists. There's so many voices out there that aren't heard. We had another curator on here, Fatos Ustek, from the Liverpool Biennial, and there was a lot of talk in there about ageism, which even got a little heated at some point, because while the art world should support or presumably all these voices rising, it seems to often be selective in a way that's hard to kind of work around. I was just reading an article about the notion of tokenism and how much our museums and galleries really doing, and how many voices are really rising together. So I guess my question is, that's such a complex idea, to have this more democratic system for artists, because as you say, that's what galleries and curators do, help these voices rise. But in the future, I mean, there's voices now that are being heard that we haven't heard before, and new unity. I know this is a tough question, but how can, as a curator potentially, or maybe just for the future, part of what a lot of people ask in this series is, how can these other voices rise? Is there a system that could be less selective, and in some cases even elitist, so that many voices could be heard? It sounds like the community spaces you're making are that, but is that the intention? Because it seems like there's such a need now for a kind of equal playing ground of some type.
Yeah, I mean, I think the art world operates on lots of registers, and that we as curators and people who love art and artists, can move through those registers at different points in time, so that there are artists, when I was a graduate student, I focused a lot of my attention on the artist Gordon Meta Clark, for example, right? So he still is someone that I look to when thinking about some of these kinds of questions. Certainly, the 70s is now a long time ago, but he was able to sort of bring forward a certain kinds of imagery, like graffiti, and make a lot of comments about the urban scene, about gentrification, about people's lives sort of through these objects. But he was also making incredibly personal art. And he was very much sort of part of the avant-garde, absolutely, 112 Green Street, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's people like him. If you look at someone, there's other artists like Jeremy Deller in England, who's done a lot of sort of, what has been called social practice art, but still, had a huge museum solo show, at the Hayward some years ago. So I think that there are artists who have been working through those registers, but then the next step is, how do you flip it, right? Because there is, there has been these gatekeepers, right? The curator is kind of the gatekeeper. The museum director is the gatekeeper. You can have a solo show, and you can be in a group show, right? So everyone sort of thinks like the group show is sort of like a starting point for getting your work out there. But you're really hoping for, a solo show, right? And so you sort of go through these steps. But I think it's also very interesting to think about this, and it might seem far afield, to think about the issues that are coming up with the toppling of statues, right? We have these statues representing the Confederacy that are being pulled down. And so the question is, whose perspective is most important? And what we see now with the pulling down of statues of people who are racist, eugenicists, and even people who did, in some ways, great work, like Margaret Sanger. Planned Parenthood is going to change the name, of I guess it's a facility or somewhere, from Margaret Sanger, because she was a racist, right? But she also was really important to women's reproductive rights. So it gets complicated. But so who's to say, like, whose voice has. So this is a moment where we see the sort of rising of these voices that haven't had the sort of agency in some cases to say, you know what, that's a really offensive statue. I've been telling you that for 30 years. And now a whole new group of people are listening. They say that these anti-racist protests are, if you add up all of them all over the country, are much, much larger than the Women's March in 2017, for example. So we have a rising up, not only of artists and voices, but of communities of people all over the country that are saying, we need to participate in the overturning of one perspective being so dominant. So how does that come back to the cultural sphere, and the artistic sphere? Is that I think that we're going to hopefully see some restructuring. I think that the major museums like SF MoMA and Guggenheim, in particular, have been hit pretty hard by not only externally but internally. And I think that once you have sort of these rebellions within the institution of the staff saying, really, this is not working for us, I think that the institution absolutely has to change. So it's not only about the audience. It's like when the infrastructure, when the social infrastructure of the institution is rebelling against itself, then I think we have an opportunity for real structural change. Because, right, for years, right, there's been that tokenism, there's been that elitism. And elitism will always be there, right? Not everyone can be, at the top of the market or at the top of people's sense of what's critically important. And then we need to think about what is important, and again, it's happening at different registers.
That opens up so many other questions. And perhaps you'd like to talk now, if you want to unmute yourself. She has a question about uh, patrons and the model of how institutions are getting funded, which we've touched on a few times here. Anne, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I actually have two questions. I didn't get to finish typing, but yeah, one thing I was wondering, I live in Hungary, and I was thinking about how in the Central and Eastern Europe, you have more open calls for institutions, like even for instance, who's going to represent the country in the Venice Biennial. You'll have open calls. So there's a bit more of a chance for someone who's maybe a more obscure artist, unknown, who just has a really great idea of something to present, to have a chance. And so I'm wondering if we could bring a little bit more of these ideas into the institutions in the United States, have an opportunity to say, okay, it's true, we kind of see the same group of artists that we've sort of agreed on helping them rise up, and maybe we can expand that notion, because you do see in the art world that there are a lot of the elite that are the top of the food chain in the art world, that they're getting the high prices for their works, and then you have really artists who just can't seem to even make enough to pay their rent from one month to the other. So that was my first question about that.
I mean, I think that the U.S., I don't know Hungary very well, but I think the complexity here is that there's a very strong market, and there's also a whole community of investors, right? And so while we have this kind of some sectors that are trying to be egalitarian, such as an open call kind of idea. There's also the marketplace at play that, that puts different kinds of pressure on artists and on the reception of art, and certainly even in Art Forum and those kinds of magazines that are supported by advertising. So, I think in the end, there's a lot more going on than, when I was young and I was actually training as an artist, you could practically know what was going on in New York City pretty, on some level. You kind of had a pretty good sense. It's gotten so big. There's no way that any one person could really know what's going on worldwide, and it's become much more global. And therefore, I think that it's already become, in some ways, decentralized. If you go to other parts of the world, as you are, there's a whole list of artists that are very well known in that region that we probably don't know in New York. So I think that there, I actually don't know if there's, there's 100 artists that are maybe known to most all of us, but other than that, I think that there's a lot more regionalism around this question than people have really given much thought to.
Okay, can I ask one more question?
Yeah, please do.
Sure. Okay, sorry. I did want to say, actually, I wanted to say hello because I actually met you because I went to the show that was of the Algerian artists in the fall. So you probably don't recognize me here on Zoom, but many of my friends were in that exhibition because I have a lot of friends from Algeria. So probably the majority of the exhibitors I've met. But I wanted to make one point because you were talking about the monuments. And right now I'm kind of working on an idea around that. And I was thinking about this idea about how the monuments, it's not just about who, which person is presented in the monument that is the reason for them being toppled. But I wonder what you think about this idea about, I think it's also about saying, who decides what will be our communal vision in a public space of what is a historical thing. And to connect to that, I was thinking about how a monument, often we think of a monument as a closing of an issue. It's like something that you say, okay, now we've decided what we believe about something or who we think is respected, and we create this, and it becomes almost a tombstone for an issue. And I was wondering what you thought about this.
Well, I like your idea of it becoming a tombstone for an issue, and maybe those tombstones are now being overturned, right?
Yeah.
In a recent conversation I had about this, now that these statues are coming down, I posed the question, what are we going to put up instead, right? And who's going to decide that? And how do we come together in some kind of unified voice within our community to say, I want, instead of that statue, I want this person, or I want this kind of image, this image of freedom, of liberation, this freedom of speech. Like, what do you want? What do we want? And I think almost more important than recognizing the past, I mean, of course, that's very important, is that we have to also position ourselves for the future, because we're going to make a decision now that's going, people 50 years or 100 years from now are going to have opinions about, and we don't know what those opinions are going to be. So how do we then go back deeper into history, to ancient history, or where do we go for this guidance? Do we go to Buddhism? I mean, where do we go for this guidance to figure out what are we going to do? What are our statues? What are our lasting icons that we want to put in the public space?
Or perhaps they don't have to be lasting. Perhaps it's about something that's a living monument, something that can change, something that's about action and about discourse, like what we're doing right now. It's just an idea.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like, of course, what we're doing now is important, but I do feel like permanent, like if you look at David, I mean, that there are certain, Stonehenge, you look at, Big Ben, I mean, you look at certain architectural or design or artistic objects and in public space. What do they do, and what would you do if you had the opportunity to create something, not just an individual, but sort of collectively? And I think that's a pretty challenging question.
It is a challenging question. There's a few other questions here, and since there's so many, I think we should just keep getting to it. Henry is asking about how much are investors interested in shaping the agenda for the next decade. And we've talked to other people who spoke to, because I think that's what we're getting to now. Also, the effects of capitalism here, and how capital shapes these conversations. But patrons of museums are starting to be called out. They're starting to be removed for different reasons. And at the same time, this is such a huge driving force, right? The trustees, the board of directors, the people with money, as Nagara Kadumu said in the last talk, she said, we have to remember museums are places where very wealthy people put their money for safekeeping. So perhaps, to speak to Henry's question, are those people interested in shaping this discourse? They take such a huge role in supporting it. Do you see them shaping that discourse at all?
From where I sit, which is not on the board of directors of a major museum, I would say that they are not really it's complicated. I guess I feel like if I had to answer yes or no, I would say no. I think that let's say people on the board who have many, and of course, pay to be on the board, so we can think of that as a way of gauging their influence in an institution, are, I think, more reacting and responding to what they see around them and what they hear other people say about what's going on. I don't see those people as drivers. Many of those people are in business or tech or lawyers. They're not deeply invested in our world, and they are, but as patrons. I think that there are rare patrons, Conweiler or someone, who really were shaping the way that we understood a particular moment in history. But I don't really, and of course we can pull out some names of patrons who've created, private museums, and of course that has huge impact, and that functions differently in different parts of the world. But in the end, I think it's really the creative people, intellectuals, thoughtful people who really care about human issues and values, and artists who are driving these conversations.
Yeah, that's so true. It's complex. As I think Henry said, or no, this is another person. And feel free, if you want to speak your question instead of me reading it, please do. She was saying patrons, in a sense, though, that, as I'm paraphrasing her questions, are in a sense drivers the way stockholders are, aren't they? They have perhaps investments in art in the museum. I remember at the Whitney, there was a big shakeup years ago when there was an exhibit that had a lot of artists that weren't represented by galleries, and so that really didn't sit well with the board of trustees, who has an interest in the artist doing better. So to speak to it like as stockholders, they do seem to be this force that needs to be managed, right? I mean, what just happened recently with the Whitney and in other places, removing people forcibly by public opinion, whose investments are, I think I can mute that. So it does seem like that is a force that has to be reckoned with, because just as the protests are creating issues that must be reckoned with, the same protests removed people from boards of directors because of their conflicts of interest. So it seems like that's something that we might see more of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're speaking to is like these extreme tensions between, protesters who are, putting out like pretty significant demands on structural changes, for structural changes, and then you have the board members. But I'd like to add in the people who are buying art as investment, right? I mean, because if you look to the auction houses and you talk to people who are are specialists who work on that side of things, they're saying a bigger and bigger percentage of the sales is going towards literally investment. Just store out those works and hope that they go up in value. I think that kind of thing is really detrimental. Those people are not really engaged in these conversations, at least on the board level. They have to grapple with this, right? They have to come to terms with these critiques or these negative press or attacks on their, business. And there's a public display and Candors, for example, apparently divested some of his, some part of his company, in fact, because of all of this turmoil and this concern about how he was making his money. But investors who are just purchasing works at auction houses, they're an invisible force. We don't know who they are. We don't know what they think. I actually think in some ways that's more dangerous, because they're not purchasing art in the old-fashioned way, because they're passionate. They love this work. They love this art. They want to have it in their home, or they want to give it to a museum. This is a whole other sector that's actually even like a more extreme version of capitalism. Mm. And, it's hard to talk about that sector in relationship to some of these much more sort of progressive projects that are happening. But I do think that we have to think about the whole thing.
I think so too. There's another question here. I'm going to give Henry the mic, but I just want to say for everybody asking questions too, because I'm reading off some of them, they're coming in kind of quick. So if anybody wants to speak, just ask to speak. It would be easier to do it that way than me paraphrasing your question. So Henry, You had a question? Hi.
Hi, yes, so I'm Henny, female.
Henny, sorry.
Um, yeah, it's fun. I get $1 every time someone calls me Henry. But anyway, that's not my art. What I'm thinking is maybe we could use the example of Marilyn Monroe and her relationship with Ella Fitzgerald, right? Back in the 50s. Marilyn promised the club owner that she would sit at the center and in the club, and ever since then Ella got booked and Marilyn Monroe continued to come to all of her gigs and sit in the center, and that started, that exploded obviously Ella's career. So thinking about including voices, we can't bring the investors because we don't have a liaison to help them understand the social transformative values that the artists actually have. What we need to do is, until we have a liaison, can we use celebrities who are not artists or in the medium that we use, but perhaps someone who is really respected as a voice that can influence the decision makers, because we always have to follow the money. And if we're able to follow the money, and we know it boils down to the investors, and as you said, Betti Sue, you said that the investors are not really driven to listen to the values of those they are supporting. They're really looking at where is the best decision to, keep their money and keep it growing. We need something that bridges those two worlds. And what if we use celebrities? Bill Gates will tell the people who are investing in the museum, hey, you know what? You could double your investment if you started bringing in the avant-garde, if you started bringing in the unheard voices of Zimbabwe, help bring this. You start a little bit, yay, Lisa. So yeah, the idea is help them understand. I don't know. It wasn't until the celebrity started adopting, orphans from other continents that it became chic to do the same and to have rainbow families. So really, how is change going to happen? We're up at a brick wall. It's the investors, it's the artists, and we're all penniless up against the money, the check writers. So what's in between that? And can we totally tap celebrities? That's my question.
Thank you, Henny, and sorry for mispronouncing your name. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you as well. I do know that some artists and some nonprofits do approach celebrities and ask them simply to tweet. If you just go on Twitter and say, I'm going to have this exhibition or mention this video I'm making, it could have a huge impact, and it certainly actually can. So I think that some people are using that strategy. I'm just not sure of the long-term impact. I think it has a short-term kind of spike in interest, but I think that real interest comes from a kind of critical view and analysis and experience, a rich experience of the work over time by many people. I always say, what makes, we have students and they say, what makes a great work? Like, why is this artwork considered great? Like, is greatness a problem? Should we not think of anything as being masterpieces? And I say, the work that people agree is great is the work that is the most generous. It keeps giving, it keeps changing over time. Your relationship to it can grow and change. It doesn't stop feeding you in ways that are really meaningful. And if that art is there, it will be noticed. If that's deeply in the work, I think, not all the time, but I think that there's a good chance that it would be noticed. And I think that that's more important over time than, the quick fix of the celebrity, talking about your work, although that could help you get more exposure, I guess. But the work itself needs to merit this kind of support.
I think that's such an interesting question and answer. To respond to that a little bit, is it also about changing the language in a sense, because we're in a time we're talking about systemic racism, and there's language that needs to be changed. There's around how we talk about a variety of issues, and historically, for example, it's been brought up more and more. A word like genius is rarely applied to women artists, no matter how amazing the work is, no matter how it rises to the top. Whereas, men easily get that, often white men. So isn't there also, besides great work rising to the top, also how we recognize it and how we talk about it? Because again, to speak of that specific issue with women and the word genius being applied to, not being applied to some of the great artists that are in the museums that are women, seems to be problematic. And that's a language issue, isn't it? In the same way that we talk about systemic racism having these, and the way it's spoken about as being an issue of language, as well as the Me Too movement. Is that something that's also affecting museums, how we raise up an artist, how we turn an artist into a hero to extent, and the kind of often sexist language that can be involved there, that is often still perpetuated, as far as I've seen.
So, I mean, I guess I would ask you if you think that's changing, because, I mean, it seems from where I sit, it is somewhat changing. I mean, I've been, I started my career in the South Bronx. I started my career actually simultaneously working the front desk of the Whitney Museum and running an art center in the middle of the South Bronx. So I've always kind of tried to keep this kind of dual, and I was practicing artist, right, at that time. So I always feel like I'm kind of trying to swimming between these different perspectives and these different contexts. And I guess having worked on these issues of feminism and putting BIPOC artists forward and working a lot on the global scale, that there has been somewhat of a decentralization. And I think it's about opening our eyes to that too. Rather than just living inside our own sort of space of the artists that we know. And, I think it's not graspable how diverse things have become. But I do think it's a process, and I guess I feel like we're in the middle of it. And I think that also having had very strong relationships with marginal museums like the Bronx Museum of the Arts, I can see that the problem with this way of thinking, yes, I think I'm confusing myself, but if you think of the mainstream, I agree with you that it's a very slow process and it hasn't really turned around. But if we move into other sectors, other spaces, we can see how rich those spaces are. And I think that we can no longer say that there's the center and the periphery. We can no longer use the language which really came out of old ways of building cities, right? You have the center city, and then you have like those peripheries. I'm not sure that works anymore. I think that if you look, I think that there's much more regionalism than people understand. I think that there's also this kind of ricochet effect of the biennials in terms of influence. And I think that I think it's when we talk about the market that we get into that problem even more deeply than we even had before around, this notion of the genius, women and other people of color not having the same, being able to rise up in the same way. And it intersects with the market and who is buying this work, right? And I think that really also needs to be considered? Who are the primary consumers? Not consumers like me that go to the museum, but people who purchase work or who fund at $1 million level cultural institutions. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's that part of it I think is slow to move, but I do feel like the last few months has been a jump start to something that's hopefully better than it's been in the past.
I think so too. Is there also though a historical issue here? I mean, we're of course and talking about contemporary issues and what's happening now in the art world, but there's also revisionism of history happening more and more. And in the last year, there's been a number of articles about Duchamp, right, the great genius whose work, the urinal, wasn't made by him. Right, it was given to him. That seems to be known now, right, by Elsie. So she was never considered a genius. Seems still not to be. That seems to be a tough issue to get around, right? How do we?
Yeah.
I
think it's really tough, and I think that myths also are very powerful. So the myth, the myth of Duchamp. Trust me, I love Duchamp, for all he contributed. But the myth of Duchamp, the myth of those modernists. But who are we going to create our myths around now? I mean, who would you choose to be, the 21st century Duchamp or Picasso? Would you just automatically go to people, white men, or categories of people who've had privilege, or would you go to Simone Lee, or would you go to who would you go to? And now actually we can say we have a lot of different artists, that we might consider for that role that represent different ethnicities and cultures and national identities. And I think the biennial as a category of production, of presentation production, has also had an impact on this.
Yeah, I think that's true. Henny, did you want to ask another question, or Anne? I don't want to put you guys on the spot, but Anne, it looks like.
I would love to.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sure, Anne. Yeah.
Okay.
Go, and then Henny.
If you want to go first, Henny, that's fine.
No, you go, Anne. Yeah.
Okay. I just had a quick question. I was thinking about, because you mentioned the Women's March, so then that took me in another space. I've been sort of typing in the box here about these ideas about where does our aesthetic choice come from, and it's dominated by certain art history and elevation of male artists, white male artists. And I remember that I was quite shocked in a Women's March that the Amplifier Foundation, they had like an open call and you could submit a poster for the Women's March. And although they did have a few other artists, one of the main artists that they chose was Shepard Fairey. And I found this quite shocking that for the Women's March, that they didn't choose a woman. Like, it was a great opportunity to choose a woman artist and elevate a woman artist. And they chose Shepard Fairey, who happens to be not assistant board member or something at the time. He was on an associate board member or something at the time, which also was kind of a bit of an nepotism, I would say. But I love the posters, but I was wondering what you thought about that, just for curiosity, you're talking about this. And, when we get the chance to amplify women artists, we don't even do it then. So how are we going to overcome this?
All right. I mean, you're opening a different topic, which is not really, so I actually wrote a short essay. You can find it online, specifically about pretty much about what your question.
Oh, great. I'm going to look for it.
Because I wrote about the posters at the Women's March. And actually my point of view on it was first of all, the posters that were chosen, there were actually several posters that were chosen through that open call. And then there were the official posters of the kind of profile of women in different, profile of different colors, kind of representing the sort of multicultural, aspirations of the march. And but really, most of what you saw at the march, if you really looked at it, were handmade posters by non-artists and just citizens, who wanted to be out in the world and express how they were feeling. And that's really what dominated the landscape. And this is a whole other topic of the vernacular creativity that is emerging from these posters in the last few years, especially, and how the democratization of the poster itself. If you look historically at marches and protests, you'll see that they were, often produced by a union or by, the Democratic Party or, even the Black Panthers, right? That there was it was coming from the organizational level. With the social media, with Twitter, with we have individuals just coming up with their own images and phrases. And then you see that crossing, you'll see some phrase that then is repeated, all over the place because people pick it up through the internet. But I do think that whole process is very much like where we started this conversation about this democratization that's happening sort of at this other register. So we're kind of reaching across even another level of register, which are people who are not artists at all, but who are making these pictures of whatever they care about and making comment about it. Now, how that impacts, what I'll call gallery art, I think is something that I think we haven't looked at enough. Because art, if we look in modernism, we saw that, the great artists or the artists that we revere were looking, look at Schwitters and what he picked up off the street and then made into these gorgeous collages, for example. I think that there's always a dialogue, just like in fashion, there's a dialogue, between sort of low and what, historically has been considered like low and high. I think that you're going to see artists sort of bringing that energy, the energy of what I call vernacular expression, or the aesthetics of protest into their work. I'm doing an exhibition. My next exhibition is called The Protest and the Recuperation. So I have a lot to say about the visuality of protest, but we won't go there.
Thank you.
Thank
I'm
you so
glad
much.
we started to go there. Yeah, that was a good question and a very interesting answer. So Lisa is going to ask a question next, and then I think Boden, and then Henny. Lisa.
Am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay. A couple of things. I mean, yes, of course, I do think, people are justifiably angry at the kind of negligent institutional responses to sort of a lot of these current crises that we're all facing, and all the reactionary style of art discourses in museums, and how, they really have to shift. And my sense is it will only shift through pressure. There's plenty of scholarship and art out there to sort of contribute to a change in conversation, but it will be pressure that brought to bear on these institutions, as it is happening now, that will bring about the change. And I feel like to talk about the change is also to bring in to other new topics into the museums, more on artistic responses to things like the climate crisis, to COVID-19, to natural social crises. And I feel like Zoom is actually, and this moment is a really good moment for institutions like yours, Betti Sue, to sort of bring up conversations on these crises, really, and directing them to maybe children who can't go to school. You know, I mean, there's a wider audience for this venue than there probably ever was. But I feel like the conversations have to widen. The artists have to sort of, you know, be brought in to respond to these crises, and pressure has to be put to bear on these institutions and to take advantage of these types of venues at this moment when a lot of people are listening. So that's about it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, as you know, I've done many exhibitions that I would call topical and sort of about urgent topics. But I must say that I also think it's important to just keep doing the regular work that we're doing. Mm-hmm. That a beautiful painting, a painting of great richness and depth is also very meaningful at this time, because we know we go to, our favorite music, our favorite movie, right, at a time of crisis. That's not about the crisis. And I actually think, while I am very focused on how do I respond, how does the gallery respond, how do we open the door and have these conversations across community, like with university, faculty and staff and community scholars and artists. That's only, I think, a piece of what we should be doing. I think that having both is really speaking to both needs. We need to respond to the climate crisis, and I've been working on a whole project of contemporary Chinese art and ecology that looks like we'll make into an exhibition in a few years. But I'm also interested in just something that really keeps me going during this crisis, because it's exhausting to constantly be in this sort of state of, truthfully, a kind of traumatic state, because the crisis feels so heavy. So I would just respond to it that way.
Thanks, that's a good point. Next, Bohdan, if you want to speak, you have the mic. Yeah, it's unmuted now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everyone. I am very glad to meet with you, and it's for me a great honor to see each of you. I would like ask if it's possible, Betti, in first, I think maybe possible in COVID time now to take more virtual reality and, for example, technology for museum, for galleries. I think we now maybe it's the best connection to see and to hear every one of us. Maybe a new technology began more communicate everybody of us, and maybe VR technology, maybe eye technology. This is a good bridge to our hearts.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're speaking to is, the formation of community, and I think certainly during this COVID period when we can't be together physically, we are thinking about, or we're engaging in community truthfully in sessions like this, and that we are reconfiguring our notion of what it is to be part of a community, even if it's a temporary community for 1 hour, right? And there is a strange feeling of not being able to sort of go out in the regular ways that we engage and socialize. But it's also a time for a reconsideration of who our community is and how we could build it differently, I guess.
I think that's true. It's a time for a lot of change. We have a question from, and I'm sorry if I'm getting your name wrong. I can't quite see all the letters and all of this. So Verneda, I'm probably getting that wrong, but you're let me unmute your mic, or you can unmute it. Do you want to ask a question? I don't see you there. Otherwise.
Okay, well, I'm a Black artist. I live in the American South in South Carolina. And so the issue regarding toppling of statues is something that I know very intimately. My people are the Gullah Geechee Nation, and we are the people who were victimized in the Emanuel 9 murders that occurred several years ago. But my question to you is, what do you see that's being done progressively to include Black and brown artists in the evolution of the art of the 21st century, on an organizational level within the museums and through gallery ownerships, and also the artists themselves? I'd like to know, what is the bubble up, to use Nancy Pelosi's term? What is the bubble up movement of Black and brown artists in today's art world?
Thank you. I mean, I think that's like one of the best, that's one of the most important questions of our moment, as so many Black and brown artists and are speaking out and speaking up. And also I would include staff at museums and curators and all kinds of people who work at museums who are saying this, this is not good enough. I think that for me, if I look at, an artist like Rick Lowe in the who's worked in the 3rd Ward of Houston for 30 years, building community and providing artist residencies for artists, and creating spaces for a dialogue between artists and community. That's where we've seen the most progress. I think we really haven't seen the progress, this bubbling up at the mainstream level, which I think Reynard was kind of bringing up earlier. But I do feel like we're at a moment, as Lisa said, where it's possible to really keep the pressure on and force this structural change. People don't like to give up power, but people don't want to be suppressed either, because there's so much other kind of power that's disallowed by this, if I can say, whiteness. Other ways of thinking, if we look globally as well. And, I don't really have an answer exactly, except I think that each person needs to work with the anti-racist movement in their own way, in their own cultural sphere, in their own artistic community, and be part of the change, because it's only going to happen, I think, one person at a time, as change, I think, does. So, that's why, white silence is violence, all of those kinds of things that are, those phrases, which have become so popular, is really engaging people other than Black and brown people in these conversations more widely than I've seen before. But I still think that it's about shifting the narrative is not easy, but you go with Toni Morrison and you just keep working it, right? You keep bringing up these perspectives, and I think the tearing down of statues is a great topic to really unpack. Maybe Thomas Jefferson did some great things, but he did horrible things. And if you're a Black American, that's what you really understand him to have been, as a slave owner of 600 slaves that were treated poorly. But then you know, it's not simple. But I think each one of us needs to do our part, and that's where change happens.
Thank you. Henny, you had a question. Would you like to speak next?
Yeah, I guess I want to, dabble a little bit in the abstract and, see who wants to play with me. We've already established that in order to decentralize, we have to first follow the money. Now that we found the money, we know that those are not the voices that speak for the artists. So if the agenda has to be rewritten and we're pushing for who's going to be the voice of the century, perhaps moving into the abstract realm would mean that the message is the leader and not the artists who use the message in their art. And I want to always go back to my Bible, which is the book Beautiful Trouble. I love that every page has a different tactic. You flip the page, it's 200 pages, you go, you learn. Like this one is the shock.
Do you want to just explain a little bit about what that book is, Henny? So I know the book and I've taught it, but why don't you tell us more about what that book is about?
The book is designed for like the ADD nation. If you want to learn how to make beautiful trouble or create change in your environment, how can you use tactics that have been used in the past, and how can you understand how to select which tactic you will use? So for example, it talks about banner hanging. What's something you need to know about banner hanging as opposed to artistic vigil, as opposed to advanced leafleting, or all these things. So I'm open to this page where we were talking about the protests and all that. And this goes under the principle called show, don't tell. And what I've underlined specifically is how to speak with actions. So at protests, and I'm reading from the book, at protests, whenever there are lines of police protecting a bank, a metaphor is being enacted that reflects the reality of the situation. The state defends the wealthy from the rest of us. Sometimes it's enough to just, sorry, I need to go to my next call. And sometimes it's enough to just point that out, or you can ham it up. And hamming it up means turn the page and there we go. Simple rules can have grand results. So to dabble a little in the fantastical realm, I would say, can we take a message du jour? Like what's really going on right now in 2020? What do we need for the next decade? What do we need for the next 100 years? Do we need to create opportunity for artists? That's not happening. The people who are in charge of offering us opportunities are not ready to shift the agenda. They're not ready to hear the liaisons. We don't have enough celebrities sticking themselves into this situation. The equation must be broken. And it needs to have a new variable. And the variable, I think, isn't the artists fighting for opportunities or the investors looking for ways to magnify their wealth. What we need, I think, is a collective based on the actual message of social transformative change, rather than focusing on bringing in the artists, bringing in who was the original. As we've seen in the group chat, we've seen the posters, right, at the Women's March. Ultimately, we know who the artist was, but the impact of their art was what created the change. So taking what the intention of that particular tactic, taking the idea and making that the leader. So one of the things I can come up with that I have done was that when people were starting to share fake news about COVID in the first week of the panic, I created a hashtag called cheermongering instead of fearmongering. And I just put pictures from my garden, right? Pictures of tomatoes starting to grow in my victory garden. There were people who follow me on Facebook who never heard of a victory garden. And it started a movement, and now people are posting weekly update pictures of their tomatoes and their potatoes and their squashes. So just a random thing where the message was cheermongering. It doesn't really matter whether I started it or my tomatoes grew faster than your tomatoes. The idea is that we're collectively involved in cheermongering. So what does that mean for artists who we can talk every month about decentralizing. We can talk every month about the investors' agenda. We can talk every month about bringing in diverse voices. But really, what are we all actually want to do? What is, if we can nail it to an issue, then we can all work for that. We're using whatever resources we have, because that opens it levels the playing field so that we all have an opportunity to participate in an overall message for the next decade, so that our statues aren't torn down in 100 years, which might happen to me, and that's okay because I'm provocative. But yeah, what are we doing now to keep our statue up? The statue of our message. Okay, I'll pause now.
Thank you so much. It sounded more like a statement than a question. So, Reynard, do you want to?
Okay,
Yeah.
there was a question mark. So yeah, let's see how it translates.
Yeah, I mean, I think you captured some things. I guess you talked about it a little differently than me. I think of Beautiful Trouble as being very much about tactics. It's not really abstract. I mean, it's really much more about, if you want to be an activist, here are some suggestions of how to do it. I think of abstraction as something sort of more removed, but that was a different way of thinking about it, for sure.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that book, Beautiful Trouble, because that does seem, as well as the example of your victory garden, that seems a great way to kind of move forward. It's so hard to know what the topic is at the moment, although it seems that, we have a lot of suggestions here for them. I think the idea of using a book like that to help us all do our part would be helpful. Jock wants to ask a question. Maybe this will be the last, unless someone else has more questions they'd like to ask. But Jock, yeah, you have the mic.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brainard. I live up in Canada, and we do have similar issues with statuary here. Being a colony, of course, we have a long history of oppressed people, particularly, of course, the First Nations here. Some of the pieces have been taken down not far away from where I live, and some of the talk has been about perhaps putting the opposing view or the contemporary view opposed to the existing statue or sculpture. That would explain why people are opposed to this. And I'm just wondering, would there be value to this if we do this in a linear fashion? Yes, everything changes over the ages. If we left all the statuary in place with explanations and why it's a difficult subject and to illustrate the problems with it. So you end up with sort of a time lineal approach to statuary. Do you think that might be of some value?
Why don't you tell me what you think? Because I think that we need to really interrogate the notion of value here. How do we you know what I mean? Like, whose value? I think that's really what's happening here is a group of people had a value and they put up a monument to that value, and now other people are saying, you didn't really understand the complexity of that person who you put up to represent this country or to represent this city or to represent this square. But there's other narratives and stories that were suppressed and that were not told. Is it enough just to tell the untold story? Is it enough? Because, as Lisa was saying, it's like, yeah, there's been lots written about this. But when do we instrumentalize that for the actual change? Or when do we stop talking and make the change? And of course, talking about it is making the change. It's maybe making the change of consciousness, but it's not necessarily making the change in terms of public icons. So what's the function of the public icon is very different than the function of a conversation. They live in different time-space, continuums, right? So we have different responsibilities when it comes to permanent objects or things in space that last a long time. And I think it's a question that we really need to look at now that these statues are coming down. Sometimes they're just pulled down. Sometimes municipalities decide it's time to get rid of them, or museums decide this is no longer, we cannot live with this contradiction. And, you know, for me, truthfully, a number of these issues that we talk about is that, and what we see with Trumpism is that the demographics of this country are changing, and they're going to change, and it's not going to be a white dominant country for very much longer. And we absolutely need to think about what that means for our institutions and for the power structures. And I think underneath a lot of this is coming to terms with these cultural differences and the fact that the American culture, as it was understood in the 19th and even 20th century, is no longer useful. And
Thanks very much for that answer. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's thank you also for that. It's such an interesting issue. We really could spend a whole talk just on that. There's I think maybe just one or two more questions at the most. Bohdan, you had a question. So you're on.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I would like to ask you about future of the society, because I think that now democratic capitalism leave us, and we need more helpful, more heartful society that will be open for every one of the people, and in arts and in art also. I think that our society, for example, in my city destroyed a monument. I very like this monument. This is a Sovietic monument, but stylistic. It's very, very wonderful. This is old tradition, old condottiere tradition. And I think that the person of this monument maybe was not good, but the style of this monument very artistic. And now, for example, in America, the same situation. But when I go for a walk between this monument in my city, I think that this monument very, very artistic. And for example, racism, for example, hate understanding between the people. I think that everybody not to do to each other that not want to do for himself, for himself. No, like Kabbalah told us. And I think that nobody in metro when to see pregnant woman and stand up and please here to sit down, and between, and this is will be without different of body skin and something else, and maybe religions. So I think our future society must be more open to each others, must be more open to everybody. And I think maybe art, this is I hope like first flower when was like present to gift first man to first woman in maybe medieval or maybe begun of our society. And I think that art, that skill possible, I cannot no create, I cannot no paint, because for me it's pain, for me it's destroyed me. And this is every day I come to paint. I cannot not paint because I have a pain. And our society, our open society, must be more warm, more open for everybody. Because, like Musk say, look to the sky. We must to go to the sky. But what we to take with us to the sky? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and kind of some beautiful images in there that he's saying, and perhaps also in the middle there he's pointing to, as he said, in his town, in his city, a monument, as I understood him saying, that's at once beautiful and at once should be removed. There's the question of the artistic. The artists behind this, what happens to them? They're site specific. I mean, and these are the controversial issues, right? Just like Richard Serra's arc, tilted arc being removed. That's a very tough one, and I agree with Bodan that I think that art could be this flower forward. I'm not sure how to respond to that. If you want to respond to that. Betti Sue or
yeah, I mean, there was a couple of things there. I mean, he started out by talking about economics, and capitalism is an economics of selfishness, of narcissism, of egotism, right? But what if we created an economics of caring, of empathy, of generosity, of warmth? What would that economics look like, right? So is there a way to think about capitalism and think about, as we move towards wanting structural change in terms of anti-racism and feminism and everything else, do we also want to think about new structures for the economy? Because I think that so many people have written about late capitalism and its destructive force, certainly to the environment and to many of us. And then went on to talk about sort of that tension between an artistically powerful work, but, politically problematic, let's call it. We talked about this in art history, right? When we talked about futurism. 100 years ago right now. So more. So I think a lot of the conversation now is again, it's like, what do we want in the public sphere? It's not that this statue that he's talking about that has artistic value shouldn't exist, or should it be destroyed? If it can exist, where can it exist where it can be contextualized, even if it's removed from its site specificity? Can that site specificity and that historical specificity be recreated within a sort of museological context? In other words, I think for many people, just destroying it is good enough, but that also creates its own problems. Removing it and putting it somewhere else where conversations can be had in a space that does not give it the sort of elevated status of a statue in a public square, which is supposed to sort of represent the society itself. Then we can keep having a conversation with that object and appreciate its artistic value, even as we are disgusted by its political sentiment.
Thank you so much. I think this has been such an interesting talk. And Anne mentioned there's lots of comments coming in, and just so everyone knows, when this talk is done, you'll get a recording, and Betti Sue and others, you'll also get the full chat here, because there's a lot of interesting things here.
And I'm sorry, I haven't been able to like look at all of the chat and focus on what I'm saying. So I look forward to reading all of your comments later.
Yeah, there's a lot in here. I mean, Anne, just to perhaps leave it at this, or on another note, but Anne was saying in Hungary they created an outdoor park just for all the communist sculptures that were pulled down. Certainly one idea. So Betti Sue, I'm so grateful you were here today. Is in closing, is there anything you want to leave us on? It could be anything from plugging something upcoming at Columbia, a lighter subject, or anything at all if you want to leave us with.
Well, I feel like we really had a wide-ranging conversation, and I actually just want to leave it with thank you for inviting me to sort of play this role in the conversation, and to all of you who have stayed with us throughout this hour and 18 minutes now, and that I look forward to learning more about what all of you are thinking about, and that we really have just been a temporary community. And I hope that that community lives for me in my life in different ways as I learn more about all the things you said. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and then thanks also to everyone who asked questions. I hope anyone who doesn't have the book Beautiful Trouble will consider getting that. Thanks, Henny, for bringing that up, and Betti Sue for
and also there is a website for Beautiful Trouble that updates the book, because the book is now a few years old. So if you are interested in learning about activist tactics and art and artistic projects to do with communities of people, it's a great go-to website and/or book.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you everyone for being here today. Thanks again, Betti Sue, for sharing your time, and I wish everybody a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye for now.